Welcome back to Death Row Cases. I want to take a moment for a thank you. I've been working on this podcast for a few weeks now, and I'm genuinely grateful for everyone who's been listening and supporting it. My first goal was to get a video to 100 views in its first week, and I'm happy to say we hit that. My next goal is 500 views in the first week, and for that, I need your help. If you're listening right now, it would mean a lot if you liked, followed, and left a comment. That's genuinely how the algorithm works. The more likes, follows, and comments an episode gets, the more it gets shown to new listeners. It doesn't cost you anything, but it makes a real difference in helping this podcast grow. Thank you again. Today we discuss Jermaine Williams Sr. To understand what happened on a Friday morning in August 2024 in the driveway of a house on South Pine Street in Bunnell, Florida, you have to go back much further than that morning. You have to go back roughly 3 decades to a girl who was 13 or 14 years old. Because according to her own words, written years later in a petition asking a court for protection, that is when it started. Before we get to that, a little about the woman at the center of this story, because in cases like this, the victim is too often reduced to a name and a date. Yolonda Charmaine Williams was 50 years old when she died. She was a mother of 5. She was well known in Bunnell, a small city in Flagler County on Florida's East Coast, the kind of place where people tend to know their neighbors. She worked as a care coordinator at Flagler Cares, a nonprofit in nearby Palm Coast. Her job was to help people who were struggling get access to social services. Among the people she helped, according to local reporting, were survivors of domestic violence. She spent her working life guiding other people out of situations that, as it turned out, she herself could not escape. That detail alone tells you something about how domestic abuse actually works. It is not something that only happens to people who don't know the warning signs. Yolonda Williams likely knew the warning signs better than almost anyone. She would have recognized them in the people she counseled. Recognizing danger and being able to leave it are two very different things. And the space between those two things is where a lot of victims spend years of their lives, sometimes their entire lives. Her husband was Jermaine Williams Sr. At the time of the murder, he was 52 years old. The two of them had a history that, by Yolonda's own account, stretched back to when she was still a teenager. In a petition for a protective injunction filed in 2022, 2.5 years before her death, Yolonda wrote that Jermaine had been abusing her and threatening her life since she was 13 or 14 years old. If that account is accurate, it means the relationship that would eventually end with her death began not as an adult partnership between two equals, but during her childhood, and that the abuse she described was present from close to the very beginning. By the time she died, Yolonda had told police that her husband had been beating her for 30 years. 30 years is not a phrase people use loosely. It suggests a pattern so long and so consistent that it had become, in some terrible sense, the baseline of her adult life. She told investigators she had been afraid to report it for a very specific reason. She believed that if she did, he would kill her. We now know that fear was not irrational. Before we go further into what happened in August 2024, it's worth spending a few minutes on who Jermaine Williams was, because one detail that came out later during his trial complicates any simple explanation for his violence. During the penalty phase of his trial, the defense called a psychologist to testify, hoping to offer the jury some mitigating context, some reason to spare his life. Under cross-examination, that psychologist had to concede something that undercut the defense's own case. Jermaine Williams did not grow up witnessing domestic abuse between his own parents. There was no clear intergenerational pattern to point to. No obvious inherited trauma that a jury could use to understand, even partially, where his violence came from. Whatever explains 3 decades of abusing Yolonda, it wasn't simply that he learned it at home as a child. The same psychologist had to acknowledge something else on the stand, that Jermaine had a long-running pattern of infidelity, including what prosecutors described as a 30-year relationship with another woman. a relationship that ran parallel to his marriage for roughly as long as the marriage itself, and with whom he had a child. 30 years of one relationship, 30 years of another, hidden alongside it. Two timelines that ran side by side for most of Yolonda's adult life, one of them defined by abuse she endured, the other defined by a secret he kept. What emerges from the trial record isn't a portrait of a man who lost control in a single tragic moment. It's a portrait of decades of sustained behavior, control maintained over one person, while another relationship was built and hidden in parallel. That distinction matters because it shapes how prosecutors would eventually argue this case was not a crime of passion, but the final act of a much longer pattern. That pattern had already produced a criminal record before Yolanda died. On January 23, 2022, police were called to the couple's home on South Pine Street. According to the charging affidavit, Yolanda told officers that Jermaine had struck her multiple times that morning. The trigger, according to the affidavit, was that she had spent $80 on a manicure. He was upset about the money and threatened to smash her nails with a hammer unless she cut off the false nails she'd had done. She did. He left the house, then he came back, and the argument escalated again, this time because he believed she was having an affair. That incident resulted in Jermaine being charged with aggravated battery, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and tampering with a witness. He pleaded no contest and was placed on probation. As a condition of that probation, he was permitted to have contact with Yolanda only in writing. A court also granted her an injunction for protection following the arrest. That injunction was later dismissed. We don't know from the public record exactly why. Protective injunctions in domestic violence cases are dismissed for many reasons, sometimes because the victim, under continued pressure or fear, or simply the practical difficulty of separating a life from an abuser, decides not to pursue it further. What we do know is that at the time of the January 2022 arrest, this was already Jermaine's third booking into the Flagler County Jail, following the domestic assault, battery, and witness tampering charges, and a separate arrest the following month for false imprisonment. This was not a first offense. It was not even a second. It was a documented, repeating pattern on record with the courts, 2.5 years before Yolonda Williams died. He was still on probation from that 2022 case when he killed her. Now we come to the morning of August 2nd, 2024. Yolanda was getting ready for work. That morning, Jermaine disabled her car. The apparent reason, according to how prosecutors would later present it at trial, was so that she would have to ask him for a ride. Instead, she called her mother. It seems to have been around this point that the two of them argued. Surveillance footage and ring camera video from multiple angles around the property captured much of what followed, and prosecutors would later walk the jury through it frame by frame. According to that footage, the argument itself was verbal only. No pushing, no visible gestures of violence, nothing that on its face signaled what was about to happen. Then Jermaine went back inside the house. He came back out roughly a minute and 10 seconds later. He was carrying a kitchen knife with an 8-inch blade. What followed lasted, according to the video evidence presented at trial, around 1 minute and 50 seconds. Jermaine stabbed Yolanda somewhere between 18 and 20 times. In the driveway of the home they shared, in view of at least 2 surveillance cameras and dozens of ring camera clips that would later be entered into evidence. Their 14-year-old son heard the commotion from inside the house and ran outside. He tried to stop the attack. According to testimony at trial, Jermaine swung the knife at his own son and told him to get away. At almost the same moment, Jermaine's father happened to be driving toward the house. He heard someone screaming, looked over, and realized the person on the ground was his daughter-in-law. He ordered his son to get away from her. When Jermaine didn't stop, his father retrieved a gun from his truck, pointed it at his own son, and told him that if he didn't stop, he would shoot him. Only then did the attack end. During the assault, Jermaine had used a wooden sign from the garage, one that bore the name of his sister, Patience, to strike Yolanda. The sign broke in half from the force of the blow. Yolanda was taken to Advent Health Hospital in critical condition. She died there. When police interviewed Jermaine afterward, he told them that something Yolanda said had, in his words, pushed him over the edge. He claimed he remembered her statement, but not what he did immediately after. He described blacking out. It's worth noting, and prosecutors would later note this too, that this kind of claim, a loss of memory paired with a specific, coherent account of provocation, is the familiar pattern in cases like this, and courts tend to treat it with considerable skepticism, particularly when it's paired with the kind of deliberate, sequential actions captured on video. Disabling a car, going inside, retrieving a weapon, returning and continuing the attack even as a teenage son and an armed father both tried to stop him. Jermaine was arrested at the scene. He was found lying on the ground near Yolanda with blood on his pants and clothing. He was charged with first-degree murder. A grand jury indicted him 3 weeks later. His trial began in July 2026, nearly 2 years after Yolanda's death. It was notably the first death penalty trial in Flagler County since 2007, or by some counts since 2009, the first time in almost 2 decades that this small county's court system and its jury pool had to grapple directly with a capital case. That unfamiliarity showed during jury selection. Of the first pool of 75 potential jurors summoned, all but 28 were excused, citing personal hardship, prior exposure to media coverage of the case, or objections to capital punishment itself. The court had to summon 100 additional potential jurors just to fill out the panel. Eventually, a jury of 12 with 3 alternates, 12 women and 3 men, including alternates, was seated. Before the trial began, the judge ruled on a motion that would shape the entire defense strategy. Jermaine's attorneys had signaled they wanted to pursue what's sometimes called a heat of passion defense, arguing that he had been provoked into a temporary loss of control. The judge barred expert testimony meant to support that argument, ruling that it would effectively be an improper attempt to introduce Jermaine's own self-serving account of his mental state through an expert witness, rather than through his own testimony, which would have opened him up to cross-examination. With that avenue closed off, the defense's approach going into trial became, in practice, an acknowledgement that Jermaine had killed Yolanda, video evidence being what it was, combined with an effort to avoid the details being fully aired and to focus entirely on avoiding a death sentence. During jury selection, the defense's questions to potential jurors made clear they weren't going to dispute what the surveillance footage showed. The real fight would be over the penalty, not the verdict. The trial itself moved quickly. After 2 days of testimony, the jury took only about 20 minutes to find Jermaine guilty of first-degree murder. Then came the penalty phase, the part of a Florida capital trial where the same jury that convicted a defendant decides whether to recommend death or life in prison. The prosecution's case here leaned on what's called aggravating factors, specific legal criteria that, if proven, allow a jury to recommend the harshest possible sentence. Prosecutors presented 4. They needed the jury to find just one proven beyond a reasonable doubt in order to move forward with a death recommendation. The jury found all 4, unanimously. Part of that case was built on Jermaine's history. The 2022 domestic violence conviction, the decades of documented abuse, and what prosecutors characterized as his pattern of infidelity, particularly that 30-year second relationship. Prosecutors argued this showed not an isolated act of rage, but a long-established pattern of controlling and abusive behavior toward Yolanda specifically. The defense's attempt to counter this with mitigating evidence largely fell apart under cross-examination. The psychologist they called to help the jury understand Jermaine's actions ended up, under questioning from the prosecution, confirming most of the state's own narrative. No childhood exposure to domestic violence to explain his behavior, a documented history of extramarital affairs, and an acknowledgement that Yolanda might reasonably have been, in the psychologist's words, sick of it after 30 years. The psychologist's ultimate assessment, as prosecutors framed it in their closing arguments, was that Jermaine killed Yolanda to preserve his identity within the family, to remain, in the language used at trial, the king of his family. After a day and a half of penalty phase testimony, the jury deliberated for an hour and 38 minutes. They returned an 11-1 vote recommending death. That recommendation is not itself a final sentence. Under Florida law, the presiding judge, in this case Circuit Judge Dawn Nichols, is required to hold what's called a Spencer hearing, a final opportunity for the defense to present any additional mitigating evidence before the judge formally imposes sentence. That hearing was scheduled for August 2026. The judge alone decides whether to follow the jury's recommendation of death or impose a sentence of life in prison instead. As of this recording, that final sentencing has not yet taken place. Throughout the trial, Yolanda's family and community showed up in numbers. Nearly 24 friends and relatives packed the courtroom gallery at various hearings, some wearing shirts reading Yolanda for Life, others representing the Yolonda Williams Foundation, established in her memory. Its logo, a leafy tree. At one hearing, someone wore a shirt for a domestic abuse council based in neighboring Volusia County. The presence of that community, hearing after hearing, was itself a kind of testimony, a reminder that a woman who spent her career helping other people navigate the aftermath of abuse had, in the end, needed exactly the kind of help she used to provide, and that the people who loved her were not going to let her case pass through the courts quietly. If Jermaine Williams is ultimately sentenced to death, he would become only the 5th person sentenced to death in Flagler County's history going back to 1924. Of the 4 before him, only 1 has actually been executed. 3 had their sentences commuted to life in prison over the years. That context matters. A jury recommendation for death, even a near unanimous one, is not the end of a case. It's frequently just the beginning of a much longer legal road, one that, as we've seen in other cases on this podcast, can stretch on for decades. What makes this case difficult to sit with isn't uncertainty about what happened. Unlike some of the cases we cover on this show, there's no real ambiguity here about guilt. There's video from multiple angles. There's a documented history stretching back years, and by Yolanda's own account, decades. The difficult part is something else. It's the fact that the system had chances to intervene long before August 2024. And each time, for one reason or another, those chances didn't hold. An injunction was granted and then dismissed. A conviction resulted in probation and a restriction to written contact, not separation, not incarceration. A 30-year pattern of abuse produced exactly 1 prior conviction before it produced a homicide. None of that changes what happened, and none of it will bring Yolanda Williams back. But it's worth sitting with, because her story isn't only about one violent morning in a driveway in Bunnell. It's about the 30 years that came before it, and about how long a pattern can be allowed to continue before the system that's supposed to interrupt it finally does, if it does at all. We'll follow this case and let you know when Jermaine Williams Sr. is formally sentenced.